hello everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of Infection Control Matters. Martin and Phil have joined me online. G'day both.
G'day, Brett. How are you?
Hey, Brett. Good to see you. I'm
Yes.
considerably further away than both of you two are, because you're both in the same city. But
Yes,
I'm in the UK as usual. Yeah,
sunny Melbourne. Now, for this episode and the next, we're going to be chatting about urinary catheters, and we've got two different papers to have a bit of a chat about. And the first one of those is one that was published in Nature Communications by Freya Bull and Rosalind Allen, and it's called Different Factors Control Long-Term versus Short-Term Outcomes for Bacterial Colonisation of Urinary Catheters. I think, Martin, we might have had a chat about this paper a few months ago.
Yeah, briefly, I think, but I thought it was worth a bit more of a wider discussion about the use of models, really, using this as a way in, really, because this is a model looking at how bacteria colonize catheters. And for me, what it showed was that the factors driving colonization are totally different, depending on whether the catheter's in for a few days or several months. I mean, depends on what you define as a short-term and long-term catheter, because where's the cutoff? But there we are. So I thought that was really quite interesting, because therefore, should our strategies be different for short and long-term catheters? And people do claim that antimicrobial coatings might only be effective in short-term situations. Is that necessarily true as well? So I thought it was worth a chat about it anyway.
Yeah, and of course, some of us are getting to the age where urinary catheters might become a bit more of a necessity. So let's.
Yes, I'm heading in that direction, and there we are. Thanks for
that. We're all heading in that direction.
Well, that's true. Yeah, I'm closer to the finish line, as it were.
So, Martin, what do they do in this modelling paper?
Okay, so this is a group who are scientists, mathematicians, etc., and they worked up this quantitative model on how bacteria colonize a catheter. So what they did, they started to split up the system by 4 different connected parts. There's the outside of the catheter, the bacteria, the catheter lumen, looking at the urine flow, and then the inside of the catheter, the luminal surface. And they looked at how bacteria therefore move up the outside of the catheter from the urethral meatus in this like wave along the catheter surface. The multiplication of the organisms in the residual urine that always sits in the bladder, because with a Foley catheter, there's always a small amount of residual, or it could be a large amount depending on where you position your catheter bag. And the point is, humans produce fresh urine all the time, which then dilutes and flushes this out in theory. Then the urine's carried down the catheter inside the catheter. Some are washed away, some attached to the inside wall if they get an opportunity to. And you end up with a biofilm inside the catheter. So they then looked at all of these processes and described things like growth rates, movement and motility along surfaces, attachment and detachment, and dilution. In other words, how easy it is for the organisms to stick to or come off a surface, and how much urine flow is required to wash them away. And then they started to run loads of simulations on this using naturally occurring parameters like urethral length, urine production rates, and bacterial doubling times. And they therefore could predict long and short-term outcomes from this model. So I thought that was quite an interesting way of going about it. I've not seen a paper like this before. Possibly it's been done before, but it's not something I picked up on anyway.
Do you remember if they looked at, I guess, the risk of colonization from the actual insertion process itself, or whilst the urinary catheter is in place, that risk of intra and extra colonization, I guess,
Yeah, it was while it was in place. They didn't really factor in the actual contamination during insertion, which I know is an interest of yours. But I thought it would actually fit with your previous work, actually, because if you're reducing the risk of initial colonization and potentially transmission up the urethra, that might explain part of your excellent findings in your short-term catheter study. But I thought it was quite interesting anyway.
Mathematical models what's the saying? They're always wrong, but sometimes useful.
All are wrong, but some. Yeah, was it Box? Yeah, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Well, I think this is potentially a useful one, because it sort of gives you something to actually look at in clinical practice. Because for short-term catheters, it wasn't actually urine output, but urethral length and bacterial motility and growth on the catheter surface that determines whether they reach the bladder in time to cause infection. So that, for me, would sort of fit with your paper on reducing contamination at insertion. And I know Susan Wang has done some work on daily metal cleaning as part of the overall chlorhexidine bathing package. And I think it was a secondary or even tertiary analysis. They seemed to suggest that CAUTI rates were lower, but that wasn't how they did the study. So, another study moving on from yours could be, daily or twice daily re-cleansing of the urethra while a short-term catheter's in, possibly to reduce.
Watch this space, Martin. Watch this space.
Okay. So I thought that was quite interesting. But for the longer term ones, the tipping point was actually the urine production rate. So if there was enough of a urine output, then you didn't get establishment of the bacteria. But if it was low, colonisation becomes completely inevitable. And residual urine volume also matters. So I thought it's like a virtual catheter experiment where you can dial up different things, isn't it? Like hydration or catheter nets or.
Well, that's what I was going to say. So what you're saying is the more urine production, the less risk.
Yeah. Which is not surprising, is it? Are we surprised by that outcome?
No.
You might encourage people to drink fluids to avoid, that sort of thing. Because it was the urine production rate, the residual bladder urine volume that also had an impact as well. So I sort of didn't think any of the findings were particularly surprising. It was just good to sort of see it in paper and see it as modelled and probably reaffirm what you had possibly suspected, and backs up the encouragement of people to drink fluids when they've got a urinary catheter in.
Hey, Phil, the work that you've been doing in aged care, I know probably a bit side from this, but has this ever come up in terms of your discussions with all the different aged care providers you've been in working with in recent times in terms of hydration and urinary tract infection prevention? Is that something that's on their radar or?
It hasn't come up specifically as an issue, Brett, I've got to say. The surveillance that we've done to date hasn't identified a lot of UTIs.
And you've done a huge amount of work with consumers and co-design, and has that come up with consumers, like residents in aged care either? UTIs?
Not to date, again, but we're about hopefully going to expand that study and have a much larger participant to look at. But to the smaller group that we looked at, it didn't come up as an issue, I must say. But that's not to say it's not an issue. It just wasn't discussed with our dealings with them.
I mean, for me, the thing is that the elderly are famous for not drinking much. I know my father, towards the end of his life, didn't want to drink because he didn't want to get up and go to the loo at night. And they sort of established this pattern of not drinking as much because it makes life slightly more inconvenient, potentially. I don't know. I mean, it'd be nice to do some qualitative work on this. And does that then transfer into when people have a catheter in? Are they out of the habit of drinking large volumes? Do they actually understand? Do we say to them, you need to drink a lot of urine, a lot of fluids?
A lot of urine.
You're flushing this. Yeah, drink a lot of urine. Yeah. I mean, that might have happened on sailing boats years ago, but not forgotten. Yeah, I'm just taking the pee there, aren't you, Brett? But anyway, boom, boom. Oh, boom, boom. Yeah. I mean, do we say to people, you have to have a certain volume of fluid a day? Because there was actually a cutoff.
Yeah, they look at the threshold as 1.16 mils per minute of urine production.
Yeah.
Will determine whether or not bacteria develops. But they also put the fact up that 70% of females and 65% of males in the US population fall below that threshold anyhow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is why
acceptability.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say, the other value about doing these types of modelling studies is it gives you a starting point to think about a threshold that you're aiming for in clinical practice. I remember a colleague of mine led a review looking at hydration and the UTI and UTI prevention to see if there was a link in the literature. But one of the challenges, what's the threshold we're trying to reach here that we think is the tipping point of reducing the risk of a UTI. And so that's why I think these studies are useful, because everyone's got their own measurements and own guide. Is it 1 litre a day? Is it 2 litres? Is it what is it? And so it's very difficult to compare those hydration studies without having some arbitrary or, in fact, defined threshold that we're going to try and compare against or achieve. So again, I guess that's good value for these types of studies in that context as well.
I guess we probably should, for context, say that what we're talking about is the long-term catheterization.
Absolutely,
part of this modelling. Different outcomes for the short-term catheterization.
Do you think that this has implications for antimicrobial coating catheters, and I guess whether that has any value in short-term catheters as well? I mean, if we're going to potentially reduce the risk of this of bacteria in the urine, I wonder if that's something that they explore that, Martin, in this paper.
Well, they're suggesting that short-term catheterization might be more amenable to an impact of having a coated catheter, because it was going to reduce the risk of migration. So bacteria actually reaching the bladder. So anything that slows that down before you get the catheter out has potentially got utility. Whereas in long-term catheters, it didn't seem to make a blind bit of difference. It's all about keeping the residual down, which is, increasing the flow. And it was, to me, it was just a tiny amount extra, really. It was only by increasing your urine production by 300 mils a day, reduce your infection risk by about 10%. And if you could increase it by a litre and a half a day, that's a halved infection risk. So if you can get 2 to 2.5 litres a day through a system, which is over a whole day, I think probably not impossible, if people are charting it. And people don't tend to chart urine output in the long-term catheter. I've never seen anybody really measuring that. So is there something there that might make it a bit easier? I don't know.
The other thing I liked about this paper, there's a figure 1 in the paper, and it's just a really nice diagram of the sort of ways in which bacteria can be transported, how it can grow along the luminal surface, at the outer and inner luminal surface. And that sort of concept that there might already be bacteria in the bladder anyway. So I think it was a useful figure that might be useful for training purposes, educational purposes down the track as well.
I mean, the other point they did make, though, apart from the flow, was residual. And how many times do we see a catheter bag that's a bit kinked and the flow isn't quite right? So it's reminding people that actually keeping the bag low, so that there's no kinks or no loops or anything like that to stop backflow and pooling, is really important as well. And it's why it's important. This is going to allow the bladder to be continually drained rather than pooling up in the bladder. Because how many times do we see people, the bag's not quite right, and when you move it at all, suddenly a half a litre of fluid drains. So that's been sitting there as a residual, allowing bacterial growth in a nice warm space all of that time. So I think that's another nice little reminder there to actually show people, okay, yeah, I get why I do this.
I was going to say, they also looked at biofilm patterns. I don't know if you picked up on that. And this is not my area. Brett and Martin, you're probably both more into biofilms than I am, but we know people who are well into biofilms. But they were saying that the sources for biofilms, the initial sources, can either be the skin, the drainage bag, bladder, or from insertion contamination. And it leads to different types of patterns of biofilm on the catheters. They suggest that you could inspect the catheter post-removal and perhaps identify the original source of the biofilm.
Oh wow!
It's something they just ponder that there. Thought that would be a very interesting aspect to take up a little bit further.
That would be fascinating, wouldn't it?
Can you imagine doing that to thousands of catheters and then getting a really good understanding of what the relative risk of contribution to each of those things are? It will really help inform your prevention strategy.
I mean, it's something we just don't know, isn't it? All of these things could be. So I think that would be a fascinating thing. For me, it just opened up lots of doors for actually a formally designed study. You know, if you increase the urine output of a group of patients in a defined area, could you actually reduce the number of CAUTIs or readmissions to hospital, or could you reduce the number of blockages? You know, because people get colonized with protists tend to get incrustations and block. Could you reduce the number of catheter changes? There's a lot of potential coming out of this modeling, and I sometimes wish we would model more to give us places to look, because especially with the advent of AI. I mean, the last couple of weeks we've heard about AI suddenly coming up with potential new antibiotic solutions, because it can do the research that in a lab you'd take years to get to a point where you might be able to work on something that might work. So
fascinating,
exciting, I think.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Martin. Thank you, Phil. Good chatting about this paper, and we're going to continue the theme of catheters in our next podcast as well. So thanks, Martin. Thanks, Phil.
Pleasure.
Ciao.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Bye for now.